She was 21, and by the cold measure of the world, she was homeless. Her uncle, Silas Blackwood, a man who measured everything in columns of figures, had declared her a debt, and for that, she was dismissed. She had no family left to turn to, no plan, and just $10 in a worn leather purse. And with 4 of those dollars, she would soon buy a locked and abandoned railroad car sitting on a dead-end siding in the Wyoming high country. It was a purchase of quiet desperation, a foolish grasp at owning something, anything at all. But what no one knew, what she could not possibly imagine, was that sealed inside that rusted iron box was a 30-year-old secret, a payroll and a leather-bound ledger that held the truth about the man who had cast her out, a truth that would not just change her life, but resurrect a town left for dead. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nell Ashby. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, let us know in the comments below. Nell's education had come not in a schoolhouse, but in the ringing darkness of her father's smithy. John Ashby had been a railroad blacksmith, a man whose language was the color of hot steel and the percussive grammar of a hammer on an anvil. He had loved 2 things without reservation: his daughter and the elegant physics of his work. From the time she was old enough to stand near the forge without flinching, he had taught her. He taught her the names of tools not as a list to be memorized, but as a litany of purpose. The ball peen for riveting, the cross peen for drawing out, the straight peen for stretching. He taught her to read the temper of metal in its shades of straw yellow, peacock blue, and dove gray. "Everything has a grain, Nell," he would say, his voice a low rumble beneath the hiss of the slack tub. "Wood, steel, even people. You learn to work with it, not against it, and it will bend to your will. Fight it, and it will break, or it will break you." She learned the heft and balance of his favorite hammer, a small 2-pound cross peen with a hickory handle worn smooth and dark by the sweat and oil of his hand. It was an extension of him, and in her small hands, it felt like holding his strength. When she was 17, a sickness of the lungs that the doctor called consumption took her father quickly, leaving the forge cold and silent. Her uncle, Silas Blackwood, her father's estranged older brother, arrived from his prosperous town of Blackwood Station to handle the arrangements. Silas was the inverse of his brother. Where John had been forged of iron and soot, Silas was constructed of paper and ink. He was a banker, a founder, a man who had built his town on land acquired through shrewd, unsmiling transactions. He saw his brother's forge not as a place of craft, but as a poorly performing asset. He sold it, along with the house and tools, for a sum that seemed insultingly small to Nell. He then took her in, not with warmth, but with the air of a man accepting a necessary, if inconvenient, inheritance. For 4 years, she lived in his large, quiet house, a ghost in the halls of his prosperity. She was given chores, a small room, and a seat at the dinner table where the conversation was always of ledgers, interest rates, and freight costs. Silas never spoke of her father, and when Nell once brought him up, her uncle had simply looked at her with his cool, gray eyes and said, "Your father did not understand the world as it is, Nell. He saw value in sentiment. There is no column for that in a balance sheet." In those 4 years, the only thing she had left of her father was the small cross-peen hammer, which she had wrapped in oilcloth and hidden at the bottom of her trunk. It was the one piece of him Silas had overlooked, a thing of no monetary value, an object whose only worth was in sentiment. The end of her time in Blackwood Station came as quietly as it had begun. On the morning of her 21st birthday, her uncle did not wish her well. Instead, he summoned her to his office, a room that smelled of dry paper and leather-bound books. He sat behind his wide oak desk, a sheaf of papers squared perfectly before him. He did not ask her to sit. "Nell," he began, his voice flat and administrative, "you have reached the age of majority. As such, the matter of your keep must be settled." He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished wood. It was an invoice. He had calculated the cost of her food, her lodging, her clothing for 4 years, down to the penny. The total was a staggering sum, more money than she had ever seen or imagined. "This is what your maintenance has cost my household," he said. She stared at the number, feeling the air leave her lungs. It was a debt she could never repay. It was a cage made of ink. "However," he continued, steepling his fingers, "I am not an unreasonable man. I am prepared to forgive this debt in its entirety. In exchange, you will accept a train ticket to any destination west of here and a stipend of $10 for your relocation." He pushed a ticket and 2 $5 bills next to the invoice. It was not an offer. It was a verdict. There was no room for argument, no space for appeal. She had been a line item in his ledger, and he was now closing the account. She looked at his face, as smooth and unreadable as a river stone, and saw no flicker of family, no memory of his brother. She simply saw a man balancing his books. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. She took the ticket and the money. She did not take the invoice. She left it lying on the desk, a testament to his particular brand of cruelty. She went to her room, packed her small trunk with her few dresses, her mother's locket, and at the very bottom, wrapped in its oilcloth, her father's hammer. An hour later, she was standing on the platform of the Blackwood Station depot, the whistle of the westbound train screaming its arrival. She did not look back at the town that bore her uncle's name. She simply gathered her things and moved toward her new life, a life that began with a debt she did not owe and $10 she had not earned. The journey was a lesson in diminishment. The train pulled out of Blackwood Station, a place of painted clapboard, tidy streets, and the palpable hum of commerce, all of it a monument to Silas Blackwood's ambition. Nell sat on the hard wooden bench of the passenger car, her trunk at her feet, and watched the world she knew recede. For the first hour, the landscape was one of managed prosperity, fenced pastures, herds of fat cattle, and neat farmhouses with smoke curling from their chimneys. But as the train chugged westward, the land began to change. The green softened to pale ochre, the rolling hills flattened into an immense high plain, and the trees grew sparse, clinging to the dry creek beds like stubborn afterthoughts. The air that came through the open window was no longer sweet with hay and damp earth, but thin, dry, and scented with sage and dust. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the rails was a constant, hypnotic drumbeat, marking her passage from a place of cold comfort to one of absolute uncertainty. She was moving not just across a landscape, but through the strata of fortune. The other passengers thinned out at each stop, leaving for small homesteads or dusty cattle towns until the car was nearly empty. By the second day, the train was a small, loud thing moving through a vast and silent emptiness. The sky was immense, a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to press down on the land. In the distance, the sharp, purple teeth of the mountains serrated the horizon, a destination that felt impossibly far. Her ticket was for a town called Rawlins, but a conversation overheard between the conductor and a brakeman had caught her ear. They spoke of a siding called Caldera Spur, a place where the railroad was auctioning off abandoned stock and equipment. "Selling it for scrap," the conductor had said with a shrug. "The spur's been dead for 20 years. Cheaper to sell it than to haul it out." An idea, fragile and uncertain, began to form in Nell's mind. Owning something, even if it was just scrap. When the train slowed for a water stop at a desolate junction, a place with no name but a water tower and a telegraph shed, she made her decision. She found the conductor. "I'd like to get off at Caldera Spur," she said. He looked at her, then at her simple dress and small trunk, his expression a mixture of pity and disbelief. "Ain't nothing there, miss. Nothing at all. I'm aware," Nell said. "I'm meeting someone." It was a lie, but it was enough. He shrugged and pulled the signal cord. The train groaned to a halt beside a short, weed-choked siding. A weathered sign, its letters peeling, read, Caldera Spur. There was no station, no platform, just two long, rusted tracks branching off from the main line and disappearing into the sagebrush. The brakeman swung her trunk down onto the dusty ground. The train hissed, groaned, and began to pull away, leaving her utterly alone in the immense silence of the high plains, with the wind pulling at her hair and the sun beating down on her head. Caldera Spur was not a ghost town. It was the ghost of a town's ambition. All that remained were a dozen sun-bleached structures huddled together as if for warmth against the ceaseless wind. A failed general store with boarded-up windows, a livery stable whose roof had collapsed into a skeleton of rafters, and a handful of small, salt-box houses slowly surrendering to the elements. The spur line itself ran past these buildings to a flat, dusty yard where the auction was taking place. A small crowd of perhaps 20 men, ranchers and scavengers with sun-cracked faces and wary eyes, stood listening to a tired-looking auctioneer in a sweat-stained hat. He was gesturing to a pile of rusted rails and splintered ties. "Sold for $3.50 to the man in the blue shirt," he called out, his voice thin in the open air. Nell walked toward the group, her trunk held in one hand, feeling the weight of their collective gaze. She was an anomaly, a young woman alone in a place of men and decay. She ignored them, her attention drawn to the items for sale. There were flat cars loaded with rotting lumber, a tender car stripped of its brass fittings, and at the very end of the line, a single, hulking boxcar. It was a Class B40 baggage car, built of heavy oak and reinforced with thick iron plating. Its paint, once a proud crimson of the Wyoming and Pacific Line, had faded to a mottled, rust-colored blush. Unlike the other cars, this one was sealed. Its heavy sliding door was not just locked, but riveted shut, with a thick, ugly weld bead running along the seam where the door met the frame. It sat there like a locked strongbox, inscrutable and immense. A piece of paper, brittle and yellowed, was tacked to the wood beside the door. It was the auction lot description. Lot 73, she read. 1 Class B40 boxcar. Contents unknown. Sold as is, where is. Buyer responsible for removal. The auctioneer moved down the line, his patter growing more desperate as he tried to sell off the dregs of the railroad's forgotten property. When he reached the boxcar, he barely gave it a glance. "All right, folks, Lot 73, one sealed baggage car. We don't know what's in it, probably 30 years of dust and spiders. We can't open it, and we ain't gonna try. We'll start the bidding at $5 for the scrap iron." Silence. The men looked at the car, then at each other, and shook their heads. The cost of cutting it open and hauling it away would be more than the scrap was worth. $5, gentlemen? $4 for the iron? The auctioneer's gaze swept the small crowd and landed on Nell. He seemed about to move on, but she raised her hand, a small, hesitant gesture. "I'll bid $4, she said, her voice clear and steady. A few of the men chuckled. The auctioneer's eyebrows went up. $4 from the young lady. Do I hear 4 1/4? $4 once, twice. Sold. For $4 to the lady in the gray dress." He banged a small gavel on a railway tie. He looked at her, a wry smile on his face. "Congratulations, miss. She's all yours. Just as soon as you figure out how to move her." He laughed, and the other men joined in. Nell ignored them. She walked to the auctioneer's table, opened her purse and counted out 4 of her 10 remaining dollars. She took the bill of sale, a simple handwritten receipt. She was now the owner of a locked iron box she couldn't open, in a town that didn't exist, with $6 to her name. She walked back to the car, laid her hand against the sun-warmed, rusted metal, and felt the first terrifying thrill of ownership. The first challenge was not opening the car, but surviving long enough to try. The wind grew colder as the sun dipped toward the mountains, and Nell knew she could not spend the night in the open. She explored the derelict town, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She found one building that was more intact than the others, a small boarding house with a sign that read, "The Caldera Rest." Most of its windows were broken, but one room at the back was weather-tight, its glass still in place. Inside, there was a simple iron bed frame, a rickety table, and a small wood stove, its pipe rusted but whole. This would be her shelter. Her second discovery was a well behind the house with a functioning hand pump. The water that came up was cold and sweet, tasting of iron and deep earth. With water and shelter secured, her focus returned to the boxcar. She walked its length, studying the problem. The door was sealed by a thick, crude weld, a bead of iron laid down 30 years ago by a hand that had clearly intended it to be permanent. Beneath the weld, she could see the heads of heavy rivets. To open it would require tools she did not have: a heavy sledge, a cold chisel, and a great deal of time. Her father's hammer was a fine tool for shaping, but it was no brute instrument of destruction. She spent the next day scavenging. In the collapsed livery stable under a pile of rotted hay, she found a set of rusted but serviceable tongs and a cracked anvil head. In the abandoned general store, she found a barrel of coal, dusty but still combustible. She was gathering the components of a forge. That evening, a man approached her small, makeshift camp. He was old, with a back bent from a lifetime of labor and hands like gnarled oak. He introduced himself as Jedediah, a retired Gandhi dancer who had worked the original line and now lived alone in one of the few other habitable shacks, surviving on a small railroad pension and his own resilience. "Saw you at the auction," he said, his voice raspy. "Bought yourself a puzzle." "I did," Nell replied, not wasting words. "You aim to open it?" "I do." He watched her for a long moment, his pale blue eyes taking in her meager setup, the small hammer she was cleaning by the fire, the determination in her posture. "You'll need more than that little pecker," he said, gesturing to her father's hammer. "You need a striking hammer and a good chisel." He saw the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. She had no money to buy such things, and no one to borrow from. He chewed on his lip, then seemed to come to a decision. "I got a sledge and a set of Hardys and chisels. Belonged to the crew boss. Left 'em when the spur closed." He paused. "You can use them, if you'll share whatever's in that boxcar, if it's anything more than spiders." It was a fair offer, a partnership born of mutual necessity. "Agreed," Nell said. The next morning, Jedediah returned with a 12-pound sledgehammer, its handle smooth with age, and a canvas roll that held a series of heavy, tempered steel chisels. The work began. Nell knew from her father that she couldn't simply smash her way in. She needed to attack the weld. Using the tongs and her makeshift forge, she heated a chisel to a bright cherry red, then used her father's hammer to refine its edge, giving it the perfect angle to bite into the old weld. It was work her father had taught her, the careful marriage of heat and force. Jedediah watched, his initial skepticism turning to quiet respect. "You've held a hammer before?" he observed. "My father was a blacksmith," she said, not looking up from her work. For 3 days they labored. Jedediah, his old muscles protesting, would swing the heavy sledge, driving the chisel that Nell held steady against the weld. The sound was a deafening, rhythmic clang that echoed across the empty plains. Clang. A chip of rust flew. Clang. A small groove appeared. Clang. It was brutal, exhausting work. Each evening they would stop, their bodies aching, and Nell would repair the blunted edge of the chisel at her forge. On the 4th day, with a final resonant blow from the sledge, the weld bead cracked. A line of darkness appeared. With a pry bar they'd found, they wedged it into the crack and heaved. The metal groaned, screeched, and then, with a shudder that ran through the whole car, the door broke free. The door slid open with the shriek of tortured metal, revealing a rectangle of absolute darkness. A wave of air, stale and dead for 3 decades, washed over them. It smelled of dry rot, dust, and something else. A faint, metallic tang. They let the interior air out for a long while before Jedediah lit a lantern. He held it high, and they peered inside. The light cut through the gloom, illuminating a scene frozen in time. The car was not empty. It was filled with wooden crates, neatly stacked and bound with iron straps. But their attention was immediately drawn to the center of the car. There, bolted to the floor, was a large iron strongbox, about 3 feet square, its surface covered in a fine layer of dust. And beside it, lying on its side, was the skeleton of a man. He was dressed in the tattered remains of a railroad paymaster's uniform. One skeletal hand rested on the strongbox, as if in a final protective gesture. "Lord have mercy," Jedediah whispered, taking off his hat. They stood in silence for a moment, paying their respects to the unknown man who had been sealed in this tomb. Nell's gaze was methodical. She noted the heavy-duty lock on the strongbox, and then something else. Near the dead man's other hand was a small leather-bound book, almost lost in the shadows. A ledger. She stepped carefully into the car, her boots stirring up clouds of dust that danced in the lantern light. She picked up the book. Its cover was stiff, the leather dry and cracked. She opened it. The first page was a paymaster's log, the entries written in a neat, precise hand. Wyoming and Pacific Line, it read. Payroll shipment, August 12, 1855. Paymaster, Elias Vance. The name meant nothing to them, but as she turned the pages, she saw lists of names, towns, and amounts owed. Wages for hundreds of men who had built the very line they now stood upon. She tucked the ledger under her arm and turned her attention to the strongbox. The lock was formidable, but Nell, trained by a man who worked with metal, saw not an obstacle, but another puzzle. It was a tumbler lock, and she could see the faint outline of its internal mechanism through the keyhole. It would be impossible to pick. But there was another way. "The hinges," she said to Jedediah. "They're on the outside." The hinges were thick straps of iron, held in place by heavy rivets. It would be the same work as the door, only finer. For another day they worked, this time with smaller chisels and Nell's own hammer. She directed the placement of the chisel with pinpoint accuracy, shearing the heads off the rivets one by one. Finally, the last rivet head flew off, and the hinge strap came loose. They pried open the heavy lid. Inside, nestled in velvet-lined compartments, were stacks of gold coins. Double eagles, glistening in the lantern light as if they were minted yesterday. It was a fortune. The entire payroll for the central division of the railroad. Jedediah stared, his breath catching in his throat. But Nell was looking for something else. Tucked into the ledger she had retrieved was a folded, sealed envelope. On it was written, in the same neat hand, "To whoever finds this." She broke the seal. The letter inside was from Elias Vance, the paymaster. He wrote that on the night of the shipment, the train had been stopped by masked men, but he had grown suspicious. The robbery was too convenient, the location too perfect. He recognized the voice of the lead robber as one of the railroad's own executives. Realizing he was being set up to take the fall for a staged theft, he had locked himself in the baggage car, refusing to open it. In his last hours, as the robbers gave up and decided to abandon the car on a forgotten spur, he used a portable forge and welder from the tool crate, part of the shipment, to seal the door from the inside. His final words were a plea. "The man who orchestrated this is Silas Blackwood, the vice president of land acquisition," he wrote. "He means to use this stolen capital to buy the very land the railroad has made valuable. bankrupting the company and cheating the men who built it. The proof of his scheme is in this ledger, in the discrepancies between the official books and the funds I carry. Do not let this theft stand. See that the men are paid. See that justice is done. My life is forfeit, but the truth must not be. Nell held the letter, her hand trembling. Silas Blackwood, her uncle, the foundation of his fortune, his town, his entire life was built upon this 30-year-old crime, sealed in a tomb with a dead man's integrity. The revelation settled over the small, dusty room in the boarding house not with a shout, but with a heavy, profound silence. Nell, Jedediah, and Martha, the stout, no-nonsense widow who ran the town's de facto community hub from her small, tidy kitchen, sat around a rough-hewn table. The lantern cast a warm, golden light on the open ledger and Elias Vance's final letter. The gold coins remained in the boxcar, a secondary concern to the explosive truth contained in the paymaster's meticulous script. Martha, who had arrived with a pot of strong coffee and a loaf of fresh bread upon hearing the news from Jedediah, read the letter a second time, her lips moving silently. She had been a girl when Caldera Spur had died, but she remembered the stories. She remembered the railroad pulling out, the promises of prosperity turning to dust, the families who had packed up and left with nothing. Silas Blackwood, she said, her voice filled with a low, simmering anger. I remember his name. He came through here once before the collapse. A man in a fine suit, promising everyone the moon, said the spur line would make this valley the next Denver. Jedediah nodded, his gnarled fingers tracing the list of names in the ledger. These men, I knew some of them. Good men. Foremen, engineers, Gandhi dancers. They were told the payroll was robbed, the company was broke. They were sent away with pennies on the dollar for a season's hard labor. He looked at Nell. Your uncle didn't just steal money. He stole this town's future. The weight of the discovery was immense. They possessed the evidence to ruin one of the most powerful men in the territory. But as Nell looked at the faces of her new, unlikely allies, she knew a public accusation was not the way. Silas Blackwood had 30 years of entrenched power, lawyers, and influence. A girl with a ledger found in a rusted boxcar would be dismissed, discredited, and destroyed. The truth needed a different kind of weapon. Her father's words came back to her. You learned to work with the grain, not against it. The grain of this situation was not confrontation, but restoration. We don't go to the law, Nell said, her voice quiet but firm. We don't go to the newspapers. We do what Elias Vance asked. We see that the men are paid. Martha and Jedediah looked at her, confused. Most of these men are dead or gone, girl, Jedediah said gently. It's been 30 years. But their families aren't, Nell countered, tapping the ledger. Vance didn't just record names. He recorded their hometowns. Anson, Kansas, Kearney, Nebraska. Here, she pointed. A foreman, Michael O'Connell, lived right here in Caldera Spur. Martha's eyes widened. The O'Connell place. It's abandoned now. But his granddaughter Elspeth still lives in the valley. She's a seamstress, a widow with 2 boys. A plan began to form, not of vengeance, but of meticulous, undeniable justice. The rebuilding would not be of a house, but of a debt. They would use the gold not as a treasure to be spent, but as a tool of restitution. They would follow the trail laid out in the ledger, find the descendants of the men Blackwood had cheated, and pay them the wages they were owed. Each payment would be a quiet testament to the truth, a seed of Blackwood's undoing planted not in the courts, but in the communities he had impoverished. The work would be slow, painstaking, and powerful. It was a blacksmith's approach to justice, patient, precise, and transformative. The process of settling the 30-year-old debt began the next morning. It was a task that required more than just gold. It required care, dignity, and a deep respect for the past. Nell, with Jedediah at her side for credibility, and Martha, for her deep knowledge of the valley's families, made their first visit. They rode a borrowed wagon to a small, weathered cabin on the far side of the valley, where Elspeth O'Connell lived. She was a woman in her 40s, with tired eyes and hands raw from hard work, who greeted them with wary politeness. Nell did not begin with the story of Silas Blackwood or the stolen gold. She began with Elspeth's grandfather. "Mrs. O'Connell," Nell started, her voice gentle, "we're here on behalf of the Wyoming and Pacific Railroad. We've come to settle a debt owed to your grandfather, Michael O'Connell, for his work as foreman in the summer of 1855. She presented the ledger, open to the page where Michael O'Connell's name was clearly written, along with his wages, $180. Elspeth stared at the book, her brow furrowed in confusion. "My grandmother told me the railroad went bankrupt, that the payroll was stolen." "That was the story," Nell said carefully. "But the payroll was not stolen. It was misplaced, and it has now been recovered." She placed a small, heavy canvas bag on the table. Inside, counted out precisely according to the ledger, was the $180 in gold coin, plus a carefully calculated amount for 30 years of interest, a figure Nell had spent half the night computing. "This is what he was owed," Nell said. Elspeth opened the bag, her hands trembling as she stared at the gleaming coins. It was more money than she had seen in her life. It was enough to buy new boots for her sons, to fix her leaky roof, to purchase seed for a spring planting. Tears welled in her eyes, not just for the money, but for the unexpected validation of her family's long-held grievance. "He always said they were cheated," she whispered. "My grandmother died believing it." Before they left, Nell had her sign a receipt, a simple document stating she had received the wages due to Michael O'Connell. It was a crucial part of the plan, another piece of paper to counter Silas Blackwood's empire of paper. News of the payment traveled through the valley, not on the wind, but through quiet, deliberate conversations. A week later, when Nell and Jedediah paid the debt owed to the grandson of a stonemason, the man had already heard the story from Elspeth's cousin. He accepted the money with solemn gratitude and signed the receipt without question. They found others, the daughter of a brakeman, now running a small bakery in a neighboring town, the nephew of a surveyor who had become the local blacksmith. With each payment, the story grew, solidifying from rumor into documented fact. The community of Caldera Spur, long dormant, began to stir. The infusion of capital was like a spring rain on parched ground. The blacksmith bought a new shipment of iron. Elspeth O'Connell hired a man to repair her roof. The general store in the next town over began making deliveries to Caldera Spur again. People began to talk of rebuilding, of reopening the old schoolhouse. Nell Ashby was no longer the strange girl who bought a rusted boxcar. She was the quiet woman who was making things right. She never spoke her uncle's name. She didn't have to. The ledger, the gold, and the growing stack of signed receipts spoke for her, weaving a narrative of truth more powerful than any accusation. Nell's life settled into a new rhythm, dictated by the ledger and the needs of the nascent community. She moved out of the derelict boarding house and into the boxcar itself. With the help of Jedediah and the town's new blacksmith, a young man named Ben whose grandfather's wages Nell had paid, they transformed the iron shell into a home and an office. They cut windows into the thick walls, installed a proper floor over the iron-plated base, and built a small, efficient stove that kept the space warm against the Wyoming winds. The boxcar, once a tomb and a symbol of abandonment, became the functional and symbolic heart of the reborn Caldera Spur. Her desk was a simple plank of pine set on 2 barrels, but on it lay the instruments of her new authority: the paymaster's ledger, a neat stack of signed receipts, and an account book of her own where she tracked every dollar paid out. Her father's small cross-peen hammer sat on a stack of papers, its worn handle a constant grounding presence. She was not a lady of leisure, dispensing charity. She was a steward, a position she earned every day. She worked. When the ledger work was done, she helped Martha plant a communal garden, her hands deep in the same dark soil her payments were helping to enrich. She helped Ben at the forge, her old skills returning with a satisfying familiarity as she sharpened plowshares and repaired wagon wheels. People no longer saw her as an outsider. They simply knew her as Nell. Her name was spoken with a quiet respect in the slowly reviving town. Small rituals formed. Every morning, Jedediah would bring her a cup of coffee. Every evening, Martha would send over one of Elspeth's boys with a plate of hot food. The town was becoming a web of these small, reciprocal kindnesses, the true currency of a community. The news of Caldera Spur's revival and the strange story of its benefactor eventually traveled the 100 miles east to Blackwood Station. It arrived not as a formal report, but as whispers among freight haulers and traveling merchants. They spoke of a woman paying 30-year-old railroad debts in gold. They spoke of a ledger. Silas Blackwood heard the whispers, and he understood. He knew whose ledger it was. He knew whose gold it was, but he was trapped. To deny the payments would be to call men like Elias Vance liars. To challenge Nell would be to draw public attention to the very crime he had so carefully buried. He was being undone not by a frontal assault, but by the slow, inexorable pressure of his own history, brought to light by the one person he had so carelessly discarded. His power, built on a foundation of stolen money and paper lies, began to erode. Creditors grew wary, partners grew distant. The empire of paper began to dissolve under the weight of a single, unassailable truth. Nell never saw her uncle again. She heard, months later, that he had sold his bank and his holdings for a fraction of their supposed worth and moved away, disappearing from the territory he had once sought to dominate. He was not defeated in a dramatic confrontation, but simply rendered irrelevant by an act of quiet, persistent integrity. Nell stood in the open doorway of her boxcar home, a mug of coffee warming her hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley, and the air was crisp and clean. From where she stood, she could see the signs of life, small but steady. A new roof on the old livery, the wood still pale and smelling of pine. A thread of smoke rising from the chimney of the blacksmith's shop, followed by the faint, rhythmic music of a hammer on steel. 2 children, Elspeth O'Connell's boys, chasing a dog through the sagebrush. This was the world that $4 and a dead man's promise had built. She had not become rich. After the final debt was paid to a distant cousin in Oregon, tracked down through a series of letters, the gold was nearly gone. What remained was not a treasure, but a town, a community, a place to belong. She turned back inside and looked at her desk. The paymaster's ledger lay open, its pages filled with the elegant script of Elias Vance, a man she had never met, but whose quiet courage had become the blueprint for her own life. Next to it sat her father's hammer. She picked it up, the hickory handle a familiar comfort in her palm. It was a tool for building, for shaping, for making things strong and true. Her father had taught her the nature of steel, how to work with its grain to create something useful and lasting. Elias Vance had done the same with his ledger, arranging names and numbers into a tool of unimpeachable truth. And she, in her own way, had taken up their work. She had used the ledger and the gold not to enrich herself, but to forge a community, to mend a 30-year-old break. She thought of Silas Blackwood, a man who saw the world only in columns of profit and loss, who had dismissed her as a valueless asset. He had tried to break her, but like a piece of well-tempered steel she had bent, and then she had held her shape. He had cast her out with nothing, but in doing so he had given her everything. The boxcar, the town, the purpose. She was Nell Ashby. She was 21 years old and had been cast out with $10 to her name. She spent 4 of those dollars on a locked iron box no one wanted, sitting on a forgotten track in the middle of nowhere. It was the best $4 she ever spent. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet resilience and unexpected justice. The world is full of things that have been overlooked, abandoned, or dismissed as worthless. We hope Nell's story serves as a reminder that sometimes the greatest value is hidden right beneath the surface, waiting for a patient hand and a seeing eye. If you enjoyed our story, please consider sharing it with someone who appreciates the quiet strength of those who build and restore. And for our question today, what is a time in your life when you found unexpected value in something or someone that others had written off? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.